Hello, I'm your host, Patty Enrado with HIMSS. Thank you for taking time to be here today. We have an exciting program for you, but before we get started, I would like to highlight a few things so you know how to participate in today's event. All the engagement tools on your screen are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. If you need technical support during today's event, type your questions in the Q&A box in your media player. You can also use the same box to submit questions to our speakers at any time, and if we don't get to all of your questions today, we'll follow up with you offline. Engage with today's content and let us know how you're feeling with the emoji reactions. If you miss anything, don't worry. You'll receive an email within 24 hours with a link to the on-demand recording when it becomes available. So now let's get started with today's program, a new interoperability strategy in the age of analytics and AI, sponsored by InterSystems. I'm Patty Enrado, Director of Content Development for HIMSS, and today I'm joined with Julie Smith, Head of Healthcare Global Market Strategy, and Jeff Freed, Director of Platform Strategy and Innovation, both with InterSystems. Welcome, Julie and Jeff.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Delightful, Patty.
So HIMSS Market Insights conducted this research in January 2026 among leaders in healthcare to understand their perspective on data infrastructure, interoperability, and analytics. We looked at data satisfaction and needs related to interoperability, analytics, and AI, strategies and barriers to leveraging data for analytics and AI, value of cloud migration for data quality and preparation, defining interoperability in healthcare systems, and prioritization of strategic funding initiatives. Of the 100 qualified respondents, 57% are in IT technology, 26% are C-suite leaders, more than 2/3 have significant involvement in and/or influence over decisions, 65% work in multi-hospital systems, and 20% of the respondents' healthcare organizations have 7,500 or more hospital beds. So we wanted to start off with our key takeaways from our research and then dive into our detailed findings. Number one, interoperability without data readiness limits the value of analytics and AI. Two, healthcare is split on what interoperability actually means. Three, cloud migration helps, but it doesn't eliminate data preparation challenges or enhance the value of their data. Four, manual data work remains common, even as real-time data becomes a priority. And number five, governance, talent, and security shape data strategy more than technology alone. So now let's do a deep dive into our findings. So we found that 86% of respondents agreed that interoperability without data preparation provides limited value for analytics or AI. So 36% strongly agreed with this statement. Data preparation is also an expected outcome of interoperability versus a separate effort, with nearly a third feeling strongly about this and 70% agreeing overall. And finally, interoperability challenges today are more about data readiness, with 67% of our respondents agreeing. So Julie, healthcare providers have struggled for many years trying to address interoperability in their healthcare systems. Talk about the added pressure of interoperability success now that many healthcare providers are embracing artificial intelligence.
You know, Hetty, I think it's such a great question. I come from decades in a healthcare background, and we used to believe that just connecting a pipe and turning it on was enough. And, what we've certainly learned over the course of all of digitization of our records is that that is one of the first steps, but not the only steps to make something meaningful. Back in the day, I remember being excited when somebody would, walk in with a CD and I could actually see their record because I could load it in. Um, I used to have paper copies, and have we come a long way to say I might be able to click a button and get that data? Absolutely. But is there more to do to actually make that meaningful and usable? I think there's no question that this survey result really aligns with what we're hearing in the market to say, actually, a pipe is a start, but then you need to be able to do some more with it in order to make it meaningful and valuable to your organization and your patients.
So staying on the same question in this slide, here we're looking specifically at organizational size. So we found that the majority of larger organizations and those with 250 plus software applications agree that data interoperability without data preparation limits value for analytics and AI, So, Julie, what are the particular challenges and risks that larger healthcare provider organizations face with regard to interoperability without data preparation?
I think there's a good question to say the larger you grow, we tend to think that you have more resources and you can do things maybe a little bit more at scale and leverage that. But very often, what we see is we actually sort of increase the volume of data, right? So that haystack has grown exponentially of data, but it makes it even harder and harder then to find that needle in a haystack. And in fact, it's fairly unrealistic if you don't do the preparation steps needed in data readiness. For example, a PCP provider with a 10-minute visit to to go in and look for what they need when really what they need may be drowning in what we would think of as just mounds of disconnected data points that aren't really providing information. And so I think that that really speaks to large organizations sometimes have that breadth and depth of applications, and sometimes they're able to pull data together, but that data may not be ready to be used. And so I think we have to consider uh, what that looks like to make it meaningful.
Yeah, and I think interestingly enough, when you think about larger organizations, they have all the resources, and you don't think that they have, these issues that you're talking about and bringing up.
I also think that larger organizations have a lot more resources, but they also have a lot more needs. So it's rare to meet an interoperability team that doesn't feel understaffed.
Yeah, no
And
matter
Jeff,
the
I might
case.
add on to that a little bit too, where when we think about the resources and the expertise within an organization, and you think about the sheer volume of applications, and right here you see, 250 plus, right? When I was responsible for a 500-bed hospital, I was responsible for 149 applications just at my facility. And when I think about those things, I have to consider from a technology perspective, are all the patient matching algorithms uh, working in sync with each other? Are we sure we're always talking about the same person? When we get duplicate data points, are we actually cleaning it and aligning that, or are we surfacing them as two different things? Right? All of these have potential clinical implications. And so if you don't have data that's ready for use, you may be creating more risk than value. And so you really need to think about it holistically.
So here we're doing another deep dive with the same question. 79% of respondents at larger organizations agree that interoperability challenges are primarily about data readiness, not connectivity. So executives are also more likely to agree at 82% versus 61% of those in an IT role. So it makes sense that larger organizations don't see connectivity as an interoperability challenge because, as we were talking about earlier, they have the resources to address the connectivity issue. So, Jeff, what advice would you give to larger organizations on how to get their data ready to meet their organizational goals? What strategy or strategies do they need to adopt to ensure data preparation within their interoperable solutions?
Yeah, Patty, I've done data quality and data management for a long, long time. And the first advice I'd give people is to expect this to be an ongoing process. All data is dirty and you are never done. Uh, and the second advice is to think holistically about the people, the process, and the tools. Uh, One of the big challenges I see about dissatisfaction with data readiness is organizations that haven't even defined what that means. What does it mean for the data to be ready or fit for purpose? As you'll see later, it's different for AI than it is for analytics, and it's different for different personas. So one strategy is to set up a program with governance and some simple goals to make alignment. Um, Another tactic that I like within that is to just do a content audit. Know what content you have, uh, because there are things that are flowing as part of the connections and interoperability, but then there's reference data that comes from yet another place. You can use if you think about a continual improvement process, you can use a manufacturing analogy, stop quality issues at the source and report them at every point of use and just continually work that sort of Six Sigma, if you remember those days, process. You can think of it as an auditing process where you're looking for issues in batch on a periodic basis. And most organizations, I think, benefit from doing a little bit of both.
Yeah, I like your idea of, defining, what does data ready mean, and especially the content audit. So we asked respondents to select the answer choice that best aligns to their organization's definition of interoperability. So we saw that it's close to an equal split between the two boxes to the left and the two on the right. However, 36% are defining it as more than simply moving data and recognizing the need for standardizing and enriching it for downstream use. So Julie, I have a three-part question for you. So what's the danger of having your healthcare organization sit on that first box in terms of defining interoperability? How should organizations define interoperability in order to reap the most benefits, including deploying AI successfully? And how do you move beyond that first statement of philosophy of interoperability?
So I think there's some great findings here from the context of, if I am in the middle of seeing a patient and they happen to have a few dozen, maybe, references to penicillin on their allergy list, that's probably okay because that whole allergy list is finite and fits on a screen, right? But if I do the same thing for something like diagnoses, right, because I've gotten them in from so many different places, we see, since we hold decades worth of some patients' records, that those diagnoses lists can be dozens of pages with all of the duplication and all of the redundancy. And I think that that's a great compare and contrast to say, did we all move it? We moved data from point A to point B, we pulled it together. But if you don't normalize it, if you don't understand that the reference range for one lab result is different than a reference range from a different lab result or the same lab result, then you're not normalizing it, deduplicating it, aggregating it, you're not cleaning it up in the way that it's needed. And then you have to enrich it for what it's used for, right? So just because you can get it all there, are you going to group it? Are you going to categorize it? Are you going to make it meaningful for the use case you're trying to solve for? At the point of care, right, I want to see the patient in front of me, their record, and feel confident that I know what I'm seeing, that nothing was dropped on the floor, but I'm also not overwhelmed with the junk that's there, right? If we think about the water that comes out of our faucets, we expect it to be clean, but it wasn't at its source, right? And somehow in healthcare, we originally thought that if you just piped it from the source, it would show up clean, and that's not true. You have to go through filtration. You have to go through the cleaning that's necessary. And I think that how clean it needs to be, and I know we're going to talk about this, really varies based off what you need, right? Analytics can deal with some things differently than AI, which really, if you feed in junk, you're going to get out junk. And I know we're going to talk more about that. And so I think that there's just a growing understanding in the industry that's reflected in this chart to say, depending on where you are on that continuum and what problem you're trying to solve, there's awareness that it may be pretty complex to get there because there's some extra work to do.
Right. That's a great analogy, by the way. So when asked which functions interoperability solutions should handle, approximately 70% of respondents said data normalization and mapping, data quality checks and remediation, and terminology and code standardization. So analytics or AI-ready data delivery came in at just over half. So on average, 4 functions were selected. So Jeff, what would the ideal interoperability platform be able to handle, and what are the possibilities of having all 6 functions available to healthcare organizations?
The possibilities are 100%. This exists today in the tools I'm most familiar with, especially InterSystems' own offerings. All of these functions coexist. Often I see terminology and code standardization as the most common thing that's brought out as a specialist tool because there are vendors that keep track of these code sets as they standardize. There's now MCP servers for AI to do that sort of terminology and coding. And data enrichment as the second thing that many organizations pull out and give to data scientists. But it's very possible to have all of these in one interoperability solution. And I'd say desirable because if you don't, the key advice is keep track. So metadata is your friend. Know which of these steps have been gone through and keep that with the data. And you can view that as a data quality check, or you could view that as an enrichment. It's certainly a contextualization. So keep track, especially if you have heterogeneous tools. And when you have an integrated tool set, expect it to keep track for you.
Great advice. So while 73% of respondents said that data preparation challenges persist after moving data to the cloud, 51% only somewhat agreed with this statement. So 64% said that cloud allows for better automation for data readiness. Meanwhile, data quality is reported to remain consistent for the most part. So Jeff, while nearly 2/3 of respondents said that cloud allows for better automation for data readiness, nearly 3/4 of respondents experienced data preparation challenges once in the cloud. So this is a problem. So how do healthcare organizations address this issue?
I'll say this is simply a degree of the same problems we've been talking about, and the same strategies of addressing data readiness by defining it, having the right tools, and we'll talk more about the people thing later, applies. What's different in the cloud is it's easier to connect things up and easier to have more uses. So people discover more problems. It's like your windows are open to a much bigger world, so they're more likely to more people see you and see the issues with the data. So don't blame the cloud for that. The cloud is just a place to run things. You can thank the cloud for finding those issues, but also I think this is a governance issue of controlling the uses of the data. If you're just moving to the cloud, start with the uses that you already had and make sure it's at parity at least with what you used to have before you start opening up the door to many, many more uses.
And Jeff, I might jump in here. I think it makes me laugh a little bit for those of us who've been around long enough to have done the first EHR implementations. And I remember having so many, both leaders and end users, sort of say the EHR has caused X problem. And really it just exposed it, right? It was a process we had all along. And and then there were, this other group of people that would believe that EHR would solve everything, which of course it can't do either. And I think of that often when I think about the move to the cloud, that we had both camps plus a few more, right, that thought the cloud was going to solve everything. And then we have this group that says, well, it's going to expose what already was, right, the problems that we have. And so I think there's a lot to learn about moving to the cloud, and I think there's a lot to learn as we talk about data that's truly ready for AI. That's another exposure level that the cloud is just shining more of a spotlight onto, and brings value in its own ways, but you need to put it within the context in which it offers. And I think that this is just part of that learning curve that we've lived through many times, right, in health technology.
Oh, absolutely. I have to smile at the bottom line on this chart because moving to the cloud definitely does not improve data quality by default. It's not a magic wand. What it does tend to bring with it is that the tools and techniques that you might have already had available are just economically and effort-wise much easier to turn on. I know that for example, InterSystems hosts things for our customers, and we're able to turn on and staff the facilities that are needed for deduplication, normalization, uh, things that were available but just weren't being used on-prem. That's not because you move to the cloud. That's just because being in the cloud makes it easier to get the compute resources to run things you could have done.
Yeah, those are all great points. I really like the idea of that it exposes, the issues because now you can do something about it.
Exactly.
So we wanted to understand respondent satisfaction levels within different areas related to how their data is received. So 67% believe their organization is ready for analytics, but only 17% are very satisfied with this ability. So across the board, the level of those that are very satisfied is low. So over a quarter are dissatisfied with their current standardization, data consistency across sources, and readiness for AI ML applications. So in the gray bar, we can see a similar story for those who are unsure. So here's another schism between healthcare organizations' satisfaction levels for readiness and their ability to execute. So Jeff, how can healthcare organizations get their satisfaction levels for readiness aligned with their ability to execute?
Very deep question, Patty. You're a specialist at that. Um, there are a number of techniques, but uh, the folks that are very, very satisfied have been at it for a while, typically, and they've developed not just the processes, but the data literacy within their organization to understand how to do this and how to become satisfied. So one technique I like to suggest is to split this kind of thing into sort of current use satisfaction, the things you do every day. Let's say you're doing uh, clinical quality measures, that you're doing that every day, and that satisfaction you can drive up using the sort of manufacturing audit processes that I talked about. Uh, and then the net new things or the areas where you're exploring, because that tends to be where you find the gaps in the data. There's a new initiative, or there's a new system, or there's a new data source. Um, so separate out those two, and you can almost use a bimodal IT approach for those. The things that are keeping the lights on, that you're running every day, you can keep a dashboard. How effective is the analytics? How often are people finding wrong answers? How often are people finding uh, omissions in data quality? Because duplications are easy to find. Normalizations are trickier, but very, very possible. It's the omissions that you're just missing things that are the trickiest. Um, and then the things that are new explorations, and often this includes AI today, um, treat them with a different mentality, not a continuous improvement over the long haul, but an agility kind of mentality.
Those are
Well,
great.
and I think maybe Jeff, I'll jump in here. I think there's this concept and growing awareness, to your point, of some individuals who've been, or organizations who have been at this for a long time versus are still, learning in this journey. It's almost like if you are a downhill skier, does that mean you're also a snowboarder? Maybe, but not quite, right? Many of the skills are the same for analytics and AI, for data readiness, but they're not exactly the same. And you need to understand where those differences are, where that delta is, and appreciate it in order to move forward. And I think that very often we have some tools, we can do some things with it, and then we're a little surprised, right, that we weren't just expert snowboarders from get-go. And what we need to learn to collectively together. And I would say, we certainly do this, as you've gathered, I come from a healthcare clinical background. Jeff is a deep technologist, right? And when we have those conversations together, is where we're able to connect dots and identify gaps and solve for those problems. And that's when we can identify them, then we collectively can solve them in ways that are meaningful to get to satisfied, very satisfied for those AI ML applications. But it's a journey that we have to go on together.
Yeah, and I also want to point out that you have to understand if you have the resources and also the skill sets to be able to do that, and then also lean on to your technology vendors to help you with that, who have that expertise. So you may not have it, but perhaps your partner does have that.
Yeah, and I think I talk a lot about data literacy, about AI literacy as part of the skill set. Uh, some investment in the people, like the interoperability team, is often not got analytic skills, but they can learn them. Um, so there is that sort of data and AI literacy, but then there's domain literacy, um, and that's throughout your organization. So that's part of why I love working with Julie. Is she brings a lot of depth and domain. Um, so the readiness and data completeness ultimately are going to be judged within the domain. Data being ready for population health analytics is different from being ready for uh, clinical quality analytics.
Thank you for that. So we asked respondents how they are preparing their data for analytics and/or AI, and nearly 3 in 5 respondents are creating custom scripts or using in-house tools, followed by half of respondents using third-party data integration tools. So 39% of respondents are having their IT teams conduct a manual data clean. 4% of respondents have not yet begun doing so, followed by 9% of respondents saying data is rarely prepared beyond basic ingestion. So Jeff, let's take a look at each of those approaches with regard to how effective they are for preparing data for analytics and/or AI, and what are the benefits and also the drawbacks or limitations.
Yeah, there's a think about this as a control versus effort sort of continuum. Um, that custom scripts and in-house tools are give you a lot of control, but they're more effort. And I think the reason that they're so popular is exactly this domain knowledge. There is nothing that out of the box knows your organization. Uh, so there'll always be some judgment and some tuning. And that's why I often recommend when you're working with let's say a vendor, is to get a sense of whether the vendor understands your domain, not just, are the tools technically effective? Because they're more likely to be um, closer to what you need in-house if they're from people that know the domain. Um, the third-party ETL or data integration tools, I was actually kind of surprised that only half of the respondees used that kind of tool because it's so common in the data warehousing space. But I think it's part of this is because the message-based interoperability that is so essential in terms of keeping healthcare organizations just running operationally have a lot of those facilities built in. And then the manual data cleansing, um, I'll just say I think this is way overused and should be a, a, a last resort because uh, doing this, let's say on a quarterly basis where you have a big party and you really go after things in bulk, totally for that. But when you can identify patterns in data quality issues, you should automate that. So I think the the low numbers here on automation and is that's sort of the nirvana. Like you largely automate, and that's manageable, but it does require a level of maturity that you sort of get after you've gone through the stages where you've lived with manual data cleansing for a while. And then I'm very sad about the bottom one, that 9% of organizations do nothing, because I think that that almost guarantees that your data won't be fit for purpose and won't be ready for either analytics or AI.
Yeah, and Jeff, I think we responded to this in much the same way. I was saddened by these results because I think there's such opportunity here, and the overhead is so high when you're doing things manually, and you're just not going to get to the scale, particularly when we look at the volumes of data with AI. Right, the questions that we can get answered with the current capabilities in AI are phenomenal, but you can't do it if you're having to clean everything manually and reevaluate it. And so to really make an impact on patients and populations, we've got to do better. And getting the tools into the hands of the people that can use them and get the value out of them at scale is going to be incredibly important.
What you said is great for a segue into our next slide. So we looked at respondents' views on investments. So 77% of respondents stated that they agree that real-time or near real-time data flows are essential for their organization's next phase of analytics and or AI. And just over a third strongly agree. 54% of respondents, that's in the lighter green bar, say that even if capabilities are better, it's challenging to justify switching vendors. So note that 42% of respondents said that cost and complexity of switching interoperability or data integration vendors is prohibitive. And 42% of respondents also said that only high impact use cases would warrant investments in advanced data capabilities. So more respondents disagree or are unsure if switching vendors would create operational or implementation risk. So Julie, let's hear an argument for switching solutions no matter what, if achieving interoperability and analytics and or AI is the goal.
So I would say it really actually depends on what is that as a goal, right? So having quote unquote analytics or AI is not a goal to itself. That's a how to get to an answer to solve a problem. And I think that this was an interesting capture of a data point because here's the reality. Very often, monthly batch loads of data is sufficient for answering a question, right? There's weekly batch loads of data. There's nightly batch loads of data. And then there's the real time or the near real time. It depends on what question and what problem is being answered and in terms of what is actually necessary here. Do I believe there are times it is necessary to do a rip and replace and choose a different vendor to set you up for the future? I would say absolutely, but that doesn't mean it's not painful. And I think some of the questions that have to be asked are not just what, can I jerry rig something to make it work for right now for this one use case versus what are my next 10 use cases? What are the requirements therein? Or what do I think I'm going to need a year from now? Because we know that taking something out and putting something else in is a big endeavor, right? That takes away time and resources from other initiatives. And so understanding the larger value prop, what the goals of the organization are, will really help determine that. There's a lot of ways that you can connect existing solutions to each other and create this ecosystem. And we certainly do that very commonly in our customer environments. But we also facilitate getting the data into a single hub data repository to make it meaningful and useful at scale for huge volume use cases. And I think that that's really part of the question to ask is, am I solving one point problem with a point solution? And can my solution manage that? Versus am I thinking about my ecosystem and all of the problems that are being solved and how do I do that? And I think that will really inform the strategy to say what is the right vendor for you, What is the right technology for you? What is the right partnership? Because I think in the age of AI, vendors are starting to become um, much more integral in a relationship based perspective with their customers. We are solving these things together in a way where before you may have purchased software and we solved problems when you ran into issues. Now we're really talking about this more collectively and in more frequent, constant touch points and engagements. So you really need to have that trust and scale in a way that you're comfortable with to take you into the future.
When I first saw these results, the things that jumped out at me were the things in the middle. Real time and near real time being important for the next phase is not a surprise. But the prioritizing operational simplicity near the bottom, I love that. That is exactly the right thing to do. It just should not be a trade-off over being able to be more advanced. So if you're trying to crawl, walk, run, fly, I run into so many organizations that have been living with poor tools because it's what they know. And it's like having really tight boots that will keep you from ever running. And the cost of switching being high, I think, is a really valid one. But there are two things to say. One is I've seen, the tooling that, for example, InterSystems provides for people that are switching from other vendors is really aimed at making that much, much easier. And what helps it the most is when people have a good records about where their data is, back to this sort of content audit, and they're keeping, you have 1 month of message data, you can cut over to something and be sure that it's correct. If you don't have that, you have a major risk whether you switch vendors or not. You have a disaster recovery or business continuity risk, and you have a major data quality risk. So the same fairly simple techniques that keep you healthy also make it easy to switch.
Yeah. I think that what you're, both are saying is it's almost like the personalization of medicine, which is, sort of the holy grail, is the personalization really of an organization's, IT system and ecosystem. So, not simply just a one size fits all or, rip and replace and, but really understanding an organization's needs and their investments and their budget and everything. So it's nice to hear this customization piece coming in.
Yeah, and this is a very tough time, especially to be a provider organization. Budgets are super tight, and the world is changing. And for the IT organizations that are getting the data together, it's a very daunting time. And really the only way through it when you're asked to do more with less is to find processes and tooling that automate things and make you more effective and more efficient.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. So here we wanted to understand the value of each capability. So the overall percentages for the top two boxes came in high, with all but one being in the 70% plus range. So the top four are reducing manual data engineering, AI analytics ready data outputs, automated data standardization, and automated data cleaning. So Jeff, what's the value of each of these capabilities to the goals of achieving data readiness and interoperability? So talk about interoperability solutions that possess these capabilities and others that will help healthcare organizations reach their end goal.
Sure, Patty. I'd say the survey results match certainly my experience with our customers here at InterSystems, that there's a lot of value in standardizing the data, in improving the data through cleaning and enrichment, and that sort of goes hand in hand with reducing the manual data engineering. Those are super valuable, and they're also achievable. What I would say is the bottom two are means to an end. They're not ends of themselves. So having something that's pre-built makes it quicker and easier to get to the things in the top four. So those folks that are doing a lot of manual data engineering, the having tooling and processes and governance that makes things more automated and more pre-built and modular really pays off on that top area, where you can see that 80% of organizations felt like that was very, very valuable. One thing that I was surprised didn't show up here was the value of compliance. I think the same capabilities in interoperability and data readiness help a lot with staying compliant, but they're too often seen as somebody else's job. They're not what's happening in the integration group or the IT group. They're off at the chief compliance officer. So I was just surprised it didn't show up.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to put that in the list of things to respond to in the next survey.
Yeah.
But thank you for pointing that out. So let's revisit our 5 key takeaways. Number 1, interoperability without data readiness limits the value of analytics and AI. Healthcare is split on what interoperability actually means. 3, cloud migration helps, but it doesn't eliminate data preparation challenges or enhance the value of their data. 4, manual data work remains common, even as real-time data becomes a priority. And 5, governance, talent, and security shape data strategy more than technology alone. So, Julie and Jeff, any final words on these key takeaways?
Sure. I think on number 2, being split on what things actually mean, it's just a mentality. Think of interoperability as more than integration. It's not just bringing things together, it's making things be able to truly talk to each other. And the syntactic level of having things together is a good start. That's the connectivity. But getting at the meaning and the data standardization is the next level up. So that might actually help, because when you are split, simply like when you haven't defined your goals, it's hard to get there.
And I might add to that. I know we just brushed briefly on governance, talent, and security, but I think that's part of the larger conversation to say this is not a technology only question, but it's how do we set up policies, standards, processes, and have the shared expertise to get there. I think one of the phenomenal things I am consistently amazed by is healthcare solves difficult problems. And I think this is one of those. I think this is a difficult one. But I also believe that we have demonstrated our ability to do it together. And so that is the opportunity before us to say, we have connected these systems, we have data flowing, let's make it usable and meaningful, because when we do that, then we actually make a difference in patient lives, populations, and that's our goal, right? That's what we're in it for. And so I think that this is part of that journey, and I think that we can have confidence that there is a path, and we just need to collaborate and think about it holistically to get there together.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Julie, the part of the journey also is, getting these, having this research and surveys out there and getting the data and having these conversations, what does this data mean? Where are people at and where do they need to go? So this is, really, really important.
Absolutely. I'd say if you're struggling with this, you're not alone.
Yes. So thank you, Julie and Jeff, for your insights into our research. So now let's take some questions from our audience. We have a couple of them in the queue. So the first question is, how do you help organizations move beyond connectivity to actually improve data readiness for analytics and AI? Who would like to take that question?
I'll start, and I know that Julie has a lot of wisdom in this as well. Um, if you, some of this is in your organization and governance. If you have existing people and existing processes that are managing these connections, then stretch them. Simply add these to the goals and bring in some talent on the data readiness, bring in some tools on the data readiness and add it in. So build on what's working.
Yeah, I would agree. What we've seen across the industry, and we've been a part of a number of conversations, is the idea of governance and process and approvals and things like that have really started with AI being such a quick hype cycle, so much interest. Everybody thought they had to do everything completely differently. And now there's some growing understanding within the industry to say, wait a minute, we actually already know how to do a lot of this. And then what's the added on pieces that we need to consider specific to these use cases, to this technology, to the way in which it runs. But we can build on the foundations we already have. And we certainly see that across all kinds of healthcare organizations, whether they're provider organizations, health plans, right? We see it in med tech. We see it in a lot of places to say, wait, there's this foundational knowledge base that we know. Now let's add to it, stretch our skills and goals in new ways, and make sure we're still solving what needs to be solved for, um, and 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 that there's this opportunity to do this in a more efficient way and a more quality driven way, particularly when we're thinking about starting with cleaner data than we may have ever done before. And so we just need to think about that as part of the process.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the queue. What approaches have you found most effective for reducing the manual work involved in preparing data?
So I'm going to just sort of say the sooner the better, the more thoughtful the better. Right? I think that you can say you need to clean everything, but you that's just not real, right? Even our water out of our fountain has some microbes in it, right? And so, you need to figure out, what are you using this for? What is your standard for this problem to solve it, to make it meaningful? And then what tools have I already have in use that I can leverage and do that with it, and then expand upon them. And what we found, particularly in the world of AI, is you need some positive proof point wins early on, right? It's a new technology, and you don't has a level of distrust, and there's a reason for that. So you need to pick something that is valuable and meaningful to the users that will be using it, which means that you need to solve for that end to end in many ways to get there.
Yeah,
Y-
I'll pile on and say uh, one technique that I see organizations using very successfully is to essentially keep the data that they're passing through operationally all the time alongside and use it to build up automation and use it to build up the data quality improvement uh, in sort of the auditing fashion. And another technique that I like a lot, even though it's a bit of a buzzword now, is to think of data products. There's parts of your data that are used by 100 applications and 6 or 7 different groups. Um, and if you attend to that as a data product, um, you should assign a product manager to it And then there's somebody whose job it is to say, well, this is what good enough means, and this is where we are now, and this is who the customers are for this data product. So you won't have this for all of your data sets. I visited one in a large provider organization that had 2,000 different data sets in their data catalog, but they had a dozen data products. And that means that those dozen things were really being minded, because too often, if you ask people who's responsible for data quality and data readiness, you get blank stares.
Great. So we have another question in the queue. How can organizations know and trust the data that they're using for analytics and AI?
Well, I think, at the most basic level, you need to know where it comes from, what's been done to it, and how you can trace it back, right? Transparency, I think, is key. And one of the things that we find in working with organizations is everybody wants access to that traceability, particularly at the beginning, right? Do I expect that end user clinicians may want that same level of transparency 6 months from now that they do today? Maybe not. But that doesn't mean it's not valuable today, and they need to have access to it so that they can actually go back to say, I believe this patient may have diabetes. The reason I think so is because they had an A1C done 2 years ago and it was 7.4, right? And so they need to be able to see where that was documented and pull it from there, to understand what that inference was, what was extrapolated out, and without being able to see and what organization did that come from, and what was the reference range of that lab, and was there any reason that that was maybe a a bad specimen, or right? They have there ever been any others to compare it to? They need to be able to have that ability to dive in, understand it, see what was done to it, and then to be able to have that validation and understanding to make it usable.
Yeah, this comes back to the question in the survey we talked about earlier about tools and having things sort of integrated together or separate. Either way, keeping track is important. So you'll hear terms like data lineage, data provenance. They're really just as simple as Julie was saying. You need to know where your data came from. And when you're doing something new, you're working with a new lab, you're um, bringing on a new data source, uh, pay a lot of attention to that, to bring that data in on the same basis as what you already have. And then you'll have uh, trust.
Great, thank you. So we have another question in the queue. Where does AI actually help reduce the effort involved in preparing data for analytics and AI?
My favorite. Um, it helps a lot today, and it'll help a ton more in the future. So depending on what you're using already, you can ask AI what inconsistencies there are in your data. And there's a new breed of data quality tools that are AI driven. And we're working on these at InterSystems as well. So using AI as judge, or LLMs as judge, as it's often described, is a great technique. But you should only do it once you have humans that can also judge what's good or bad.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, Jeff, I think we are at just the beginning cusp of what's possible in terms of AI driven data quality and the tooling that will be available in the future. I mean, we certainly see when we are doing our work, the acceleration of, of, of data utilization and opportunity. And I think that there's so many more things that are coming, right? We do everything from running it through multiple LLMs to, enhancing prompts through and then running it through tools. Like there's so many options, and we are at the beginning. And I think that when we move forward together, we're going to see data really looking differently. a couple of years from now, not just from the tools that we've created sort of manually, with developers, but also leveraging AI capabilities, always with that thought towards transparency, validation, uh, and making sure that it's true quality when it's delivered.
Great. On that note, we are in interesting and exciting times. So at this time, we have to wrap up. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll respond to them offline. We'd like to thank our sponsor, InterSystems, again for their support of this webinar. So for more information for InterSystems, you can scan this QR code. I'd like to invite our audience to take our brief evaluation at the conclusion of today's event and share your thoughts with us. So as a reminder, you'll receive an email within 24 hours to rewatch the on-demand recording of today's session, and it will be available in the HIMSS Resource Hub for a limited time. So feel free to come back and watch at any time. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.